Professor Friedman, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Professor Friedman. Professor Fernandez, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen, if I may, so that I can have some slides. Oh, let's put these up. All right, so I hope you're seeing the slides that I have in front of you. And I'm delighted to be with you and uh, be able to speak with you today. And I should say that I'm speaking on the basis of my most recent book, which is entitled Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Now, the central question I want to explore with you this afternoon is where our modern Western economics came from. And I want to talk about when and where our modern economic thinking originated. And here I want to be very specific about what I mean by modern Western economics. I take that to be the uh, centerpiece of the analytical apparatus that we use in modern economics to be what economists call the first fundamental welfare theorem. This is the proposition that individuals who are acting just in their own self-interest, with no concern explicitly for other people, no form of altruism involved, can, and under the right circumstances, will end up taking actions that make not just themselves, but other people better off. And moreover, we know that the circumstances that enable them to do that is competitive behavior in a market setting. Now, this is a very startling thought if one pauses to consider it. It flies in the face of at least 2,000 years, maybe more, of prior thinking about the dangers of individuals acting on their own self-interest, especially in the economic sphere. But the notion of modern Western economics is that this can, and to repeat, under the right circumstances, will lead to people being made better off, including not only the person who's acting in his or her own self-interest, but other people as well. Now, I am certainly not the first person to ask this intellectual history question, and two familiar presumptions frame the standard answers. The first is to point to Adam Smith and his great book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Donald Winch, who is alas no longer living, but who was the leading Adam Smith scholar of our lifetime, referred to Smith's Wealth of Nations as what he called the fountainhead of classical political economy. And I think opinion in the profession has largely followed Winch ever since. The second usual presumption is that because Smith and Hume and the rest of his contemporaries and the evolution of economics more generally were products of the Enlightenment, and because we think of the Enlightenment as a movement away from thinking in terms of a God-centered universe toward what we would in our modern vocabulary call secular humanism, it therefore follows that not just the wealth of nations, but economics as a whole has nothing to do with religious thinking. And I think this was put best by Nicholas Phillipson, alas, also no longer living, who wrote the best biography, I think, of Smith, certainly the best biography if one is interested not in the biographical details, but in the importance of the work. And the way Phillipson put it was that not just the wealth of nations, but Smith's entire project to develop a science of man was, as he put it, built on the foundations of the Enlightenment's quintessential assault on religion. And I don't think Philipson believed that he was saying anything new or unusual. He was simply stating the standard set of presumptions. Now, I'm going to accept Winch's view that points to Adam Smith's great book as the central contribution. And as we go forward this afternoon, I will explain why I believe that's so. But by contrast, I'm going to disagree very straightforwardly with the idea that Smith and the Enlightenment had nothing to do with religious thinking. And instead, my view, which I will articulate over the next half hour or so, is that the contribution of Smith and his contemporaries was very powerfully enabled what were at that time new and highly contended uh, lines of thinking within the English-speaking Protestant world within which they lived. And in particular, these new lines of thinking were still firmly Protestant, but yet moving beyond key elements of the original Protestant Reformation. And specifically, what I have in mind, for reasons that I will explain, is the movement away from predestinarian Calvinism. And I'll be quite explicit about what I mean by that. And what is it that took the place of predestinarian Calvinism? It was an expanded understanding of the possibilities for human agency, human choice, human action, human decisions. And my central argument is going to be that it was this expanded notion of the possibilities of human agency that gave us Smith and the foundations of modern Western economics. Now, I want to clear up one potential misunderstanding right at the beginning. Specifically, what I am not suggesting is that any of this had anything to do with self-conscious intent by religiously committed individuals to bring their religious beliefs to bear on their professional writing. People like Smith and Hume were international celebrities within their own lifetimes, and therefore we know an enormous about them biographically, and we know enough to believe that they simply were not religiously committed in that way. David Hume, for example, was a notorious skeptic. Within his own lifetime, most people considered him to be an atheist. That's why Hume was never, ever able to obtain a university appointment in Scotland, despite the fact that everybody understood that he was the leading individual in the Scottish Enlightenment. He applied twice for professorships in Edinburgh, and both times was rejected. His friends, William Robertson, for example, who was not only a distinguished historian, but also a clergyman who was the head of the Church of Scotland, used to refer to Hume as a heathen, a virtuous heathen. Hume himself used to refer to Church of England bishops as what he called retainers to superstition. Smith was much more private about his personal religious beliefs, but there is no ground for believing that Smith was a religiously committed man. At best, one would think, at least Americans would think of him as an 18th century deist along the lines of people like, say, Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin. So if it wasn't that they were religiously committed, what then was the story by which these new lines of religious thought were influential in creating their ideas? Einstein, I think, put it best in one of his early papers. He said that scientific thought is a development of pre-scientific thought. And in a different paper, Einstein went on to say that we think to form for ourselves what he called a simplified and easy to survey image of the world, a Bildwelt in Einstein's original German, and that we then analyze this image of the world in order to overcome the complexity of the world. The world is simply too complex to analyze in a direct way. Among economists, for example, this is why we make simplifying assumptions. This is why we have what we call models. And importantly, Einstein didn't just refer to physical scientists. He refers, and you have it in front of you, he refers to painters, to poets, philosophers, natural scientists, each in his own way. Now, am I on legitimate ground in applying this idea from Einstein to the field of economics? Two of my distinguished Harvard predecessors certainly thought so. Joseph Schumpeter, in his great book on the history of economic analysis, argued that before any economist or social scientist, for that matter, sat down to do any line of work, he or she would have in mind what he called a pre-analytic vision. And incidentally, that uppercase V is not a typo. That was the way Schumpeter wrote it, pre-analytic vision with a capital V. My late colleague and friend, whom I miss terribly, John Kenneth Galbraith, put it in a slightly different way. He said that economic ideas are always and intimately a product of their own time and place. And my argument is that modern Western economics is very much a product of the Scottish Enlightenment as given to us by Smith. Now, let's be explicit about what the transition in economic thinking was to gave us modern Western economics. If we go back to 1700, then economic thinking, put the word in quotation marks because the word economist or economic didn't exist as in our modern sense as of 1700. I think we can summarize the state of thinking at the turn of the 18th century with three propositions. First, could individuals correctly perceive what was in their own self-interest to do? And the answer is no. The usual view is that they couldn't, and for that reason it was deemed important to direct economic activity from the top down. Famously, the French had their mercantilist system, which reached its height in the 17th century under Colbert, who was the finance minister to Louis XIV. The English had an elaborate system of government-granted monopolies, and other countries behaved accordingly. Second, getting even more directly to the matter of the first fundamental welfare theorem, as of 1700, the presumption was that even if individuals did know what it was in their self-interest to do in the economic sphere, there was no presumption that their acting on that self-interest bore any implication of benefit more globally. They might make themselves better off, but nobody else. And third, for just that reason, actions in the economic sphere motivated by individual self-interest were taken to be morally opprobrious. The standard adjective applied was vicious. This was considered to be a vice. If we come forward to 1790, I picked 1790 simply because that's the year Adam Smith died, the three presumptions were completely different. First, could individuals correctly perceive what was in their self-interest to do in the economic sphere? Smith's answer was yes, when they're acting as producers. Smith was a very clever theoretician, and in the spirit of a mathematician who doesn't want to assume anything that he doesn't need to prove his theorem, Smith understood that assuming that people get it right when they act as consumers isn't necessary to his proposition. And indeed, The Wealth of Nations and his other book too, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, both of them are full of rather scathing, derisive comments on the foolishness of what individuals choose to do when they act as consumers. But by and large, Smith maintained that they got it right when they act as producers. Second, and most important, the whole centerpiece of The Wealth of Nations is to show us why and how it turns out that when people do act on their self-interest in the economic sphere, under the condition of competitive markets, this winds up making other people better off as well. And for this reason, Smith just took it that actions motivated by our self-interest in the economic sphere are not morally opprobrious. He has a marvelous passage in The Wealth of Nations in which he says that this is simply inborn in man. He says the desire to improve our condition comes with us from the womb and stays with us till the grave. And in between, there's scarcely any moment when it's not acting on us. And it's just like the fact that we eat and breathe. Now, of course, improving our condition, which is the way he put it, could mean any sort of things. But he immediately went on to make clear that it was economic condition that he had in mind. Now, to be fair, Smith did have intellectual predecessors. His ideas did not come out of whole cloth. And I've listed here some of these important predecessors, both in France and in England. France is important because Smith lived in France for 2.5 years when he first started writing The Wealth of Nations. Nicole was long gone, so was Bois Guilbert. Cantillon was dead, but Cantillon's book was only recently published and under discussion, and Smith knew Francois Quesnay. They were very good friends, and Smith said later that if Quesnay had still been alive in 1776, he would have dedicated The Wealth of Nations to him. Alas, Quesnay died a couple of years earlier. And there were predecessors in England as well. And so we have to face right up front the question of whether those predecessors deserve the credit instead of Smith. Should people like me, who are professional economists, think of, for example, let's say Pierre Nicole as the father of our discipline, or maybe Bernard Mandeville? And my answer to that question is a straightforward no. And the reason is that although many of these people intuited something like the first welfare theorem, they had no explanation whatsoever for how this result came about. It was like being able to state a theorem without proving it. They had no explicit awareness of the role of markets. They had no awareness of the role of competition in bringing about this result. And we might say, okay, that's fine. They didn't have our explanation. Maybe they had some other explanation, but they didn't. They didn't have any explanation whatsoever. And especially for this generation of people trained in Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism, that kind of ad hoc thinking just wasn't going to fly. Newton's great work, the Principia Mathematica, had been published in 1687. By the time Smith was an undergraduate at the University of Glasgow in the 1730s, the book was part of the standard curriculum at all of the Scottish universities, also at Cambridge in England. Interestingly, not at Oxford, and maybe that's part of why Oxford lagged behind in scientific inquiry for so long. But these men were all trained as Newtonian thinkers, and so it was Smith's systematic explanation for the result, together with a description of the mechanism, namely competition, that mattered. So let's now be specific about what Smith argued in The Wealth of Nations. First, as I've already indicated, the desire for material gain is simply inborn with us and therefore not morally opprobrious. Second, at the centerpiece of Smith's analysis is the role of competitively set prices and wages. And in looking back on the book, it's really striking how Newtonian the language is. Look at this passage, for example. Here is Smith's description of what he calls the natural price of any good, what we today in economics would call the market clearing price. If you look at that, it's almost as if he's describing the motion of planets in orbit. So here, look at some of the language. The planets are the prices are continually gravitating toward the natural price. And sometimes some accident knocks the uh, price away and keeps them suspended above or forces them down below the market clearing price. But he says there are obstacles, namely competition, which keep the prices from settling in the wrong place, and they settle in the right place, and they're constantly tending toward it. Again, strikingly Newtonian language. Third, these competitive wages and prices are simply the outcome of bargains being struck by people who are motivated by self-interest on either side. Nobody is exhibiting any explicit concern for the other team. The sellers of goods, including the sellers, workers as the sellers of labor, are simply trying to get the best price they can, the highest price. Conversely, buyers, including employers as the buyers of labor, are trying to get the lowest price. Everybody is just looking out for himself, nobody else, and therefore this result is yet another example of a key Enlightenment idea, namely the principle of unintended and unforeseen consequences. Now, most important, at the center is the first welfare theorem, namely the globally beneficial outcome of this private pursuit of self-interest when it's carried out under conditions of competitive markets. The actions that people take are beneficial for themselves, it's beneficial for society, and this is, of course, what has come down to us as the invisible hand. It's an odd phrase for it. Smith didn't attach much importance to the phrase. He used it only once in each of his books, but nonetheless, here we are 250 years later, and that's how we know it. And for this reason, as I hope most people are already aware, Smith was opposed to most potential impediments to the competitive market mechanism. But here there is, I'm afraid, a widespread misunderstanding of Adam Smith's thinking, and that's what I want to be careful to clear up. Smith did not think of the competitive market process as some kind of delicate hothouse flower that needed to be protected at all costs and against any encroachments. Instead, what impressed Smith was the enormous robustness, not the delicacy, the robustness of this process. And for just that reason, Smith was willing to accept all sorts of restrictions on commerce when he thought there was a public purpose. So just to list a few of them, Smith was in favor of progressive income taxes on straightforward redistributive grounds. He just said he thought it was fair that the rich paid more than the poor, even in proportion to their incomes. Smith was in favor of luxury taxes. He advocated special taxes on luxury carriages. Think today of people having to pay special taxes on BMWs or Mercedeses. Smith was in favor of building codes in cities. He didn't have the vocabulary of externalities the way we do in modern economics, but he certainly understood the concept. And his description of why he was in favor of, for example, the laws that required firewalls between the houses, the row houses in Edinburgh. So it reads straightforwardly like our description of an externality. He was in favor of special taxes on whiskey and on distilleries. And remember, this is somebody who's living in Scotland. He was strongly in favor of public education. He favored much tighter regulation on private banking than anything we've known within our lifetime. And he favored the central bank as having monopoly power. So in all these examples and more, he was very much in favor of restrictions on commerce when he thought they were appropriate. Now, what is it that enabled Smith, and to a lesser extent his predecessors, to reach this insight? I've already mentioned the fact that they were all trained in Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism. Smith, in particular, was well educated in Stoic philosophy. His favorites were Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Stoic philosophy is all about natural harmony in the universe. And so if you do something that makes you better off and at the same time it makes me better off, well, that's an example of Stoic harmony. Smith was a very observant man. He lived in a world that was becoming increasingly commercial. He lived in cities. He lived in Edinburgh. He lived in Glasgow. He lived in Paris. He lived in Toulouse. He lived in London at various times. In all of these places, he knew merchants. Smith was a moral philosopher. He was very introspective. But I argue that even all of this put together was not enough, and there was something else. And the extra element was this key transition in the religious thinking of the English-speaking Protestant world, which was at that time well underway. So let's be specific about this. There were many elements of the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism. As we would expect, it was a multifaceted development. Religious developments usually are. But there are three that bear particularly on our inquiry into Smith and the origins of economics. One concerns human nature, one concerns human destiny, and one concerns the human purpose. In terms of human nature, Calvin taught that all individuals are totally depraved, and as Calvin put it, unable to do any good. And by contrast, the post-Calvinists thought that there is inherent goodness in all individuals. To quote John Locke, the English philosopher, each of us is born with what Locke called the candle of the Lord in his famous metaphor. For Locke, the candle of the Lord means reason. Locke thought that the distinguishing characteristic of the human species was reason, and we all have it, and Locke explained why that enabled humans to have goodness, and contrary to Calvin, to take actions that were good. Second, in terms of human destiny, Calvin most famously thought that the choice of who was going to be saved in the afterlife and who is not was predestined. And what that means is that the choice of whether, according to Calvin, the choice of whether you would be saved or not was made not only before you were born, but before the world was even created. And so, of course, there's no room for anything that you do in your lifetime, no decision that you take, no choice that you make, no room to influence whether you're among the saved in the left panel, or you're among the damned in the right panel of this famous triptych. And instead, the post-Calvinists believe that everybody is potentially eligible to be saved, and moreover, that the human choices and actions that we take do matter for this purpose. In the words of John Tillotson, who was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, head of the English Church, appointed after the Glorious Revolution, appointed by William and Mary, Tillotson said that it's up to us to cooperate with the divine in achieving our salvation. And then third, in terms of the question of why we are here in the first place, Calvin taught that the sole reason man exists is the glorification of God. The famous Calvin phrase that the entire universe is a theater of God's glory. And by contrast, the post-Calvinists thought that human happiness was certainly a divinely intended end for humans, and perhaps the divinely intended end. And therefore, it wasn't surprising that human institutions like markets, for example, would be designed so that humans working within them were able to achieve our happiness. Now, importantly, this debate, and it was an intense debate, was at its height in Scotland right at the time when Smith and Hume and their contemporaries were coming into their mid-adulthood, and therefore when they were forming what Einstein called their worldview, what Schumpeter called their pre-analytic vision. This debate was a rolling phenomenon. It was at its height in England in the latter half of the 17th century. It was at its height in Scotland in the middle of the 18th century, to repeat, when Smith and Hume were coming to young adulthood. Smith was born in 1723. And it was at its height in America in the latter half of the 18th century. And many people have argued rightly, I believe, that it was in part this religious movement that gave us the foundations of the American Republic. I think that's right, but that's a different line of argument. So it was Scotland in the middle of the 18th century that matters for this purpose. Now, to go back, Smith and Hume were not religiously committed individuals. So why would these religious developments have influenced their Einsteinian worldview, their Schumpeterian vision? I think there are three reasons, and it's worth stating each of them. The first is that they lived in a world in which religion was more central and more important in many dimensions than anything we know in modern Western society. The Scots in 1707 had given up their independence as a country. With the Act of Union in 1707, they joined with England and Wales to form the United Kingdom. And as a result, virtually all of what they used to have as the centerpiece of their independent country life disappeared. After 1707, the Scots no longer had an independent parliament. They no longer had an independent king. They no longer had an independent royal court. And instead, the only independent institution they had left was the church. And so, not surprisingly, all of these aspects of Scottish life, their education, their patronage, politics, it was all governed by politics or by religion. Second, intellectual life at that time was also more integrated in a way that we find difficult to understand today. So university faculties and curriculum, for example, they did not in those days have separate schools of divinity the way we do today. My university famously has a divinity school, but it's located about 3/4 of a mile away. At Yale, there's also a famous divinity school. It's even farther away, and it's up on top of a big hill. You really have to want to go up there. But in Smith's day, when he taught as a professor, which he did for 15 years at the University of Glasgow, it was all together. It was very small. This is the list of all 14 professorships at the University of Glasgow when Smith taught there. He was the professor of moral philosophy. But there was also a professor of divinity, what today we would call theology and church history, right there in the same faculty with him. Similarly, the Edinburgh and Glasgow were famous in those days for their intellectual life that was organized around these clubs and dining societies. The most distinguished of these was called the Select Society. Smith and Hume were famously they were among the original members of the Select Society. Here's a listing of the professions of the 32 original members of the Select Society. And Smith was one of 4 professors. Hume was an independent writer because he couldn't get a university appointment. They were there. But there were 5 Church of Scotland ministers, including their friend Robertson. And Robertson was a very interesting character. Robertson was not only the head of the Church of Scotland, he was also the principal, in today's vocabulary, the president of the University of Edinburgh. Imagine that, being the head of the church and also the head of the university. Third, we have to remember how contentious religious debate was in those times. These were issues that men fought for and many died for. In the previous century, on the continent, the 30 Years' War between the Catholics and the Protestants was every bit as deadly compared to the size of Europe's population at the time as World War I and World War II turned out to be in the 20th century. The English Civil War, which was fought in the lifetime of Smith and Hume's grandparents, was likewise deadly. That was also had religious component. It wasn't between Catholics and Protestants. It was between 2 different kinds of Protestants. After the Act of Union in 1707, there was ongoing resistance to royal authority in both England and Scotland. And also, following the Glorious Revolution, and then the Act of Union in Scotland, there were these repeated Jacobite uprisings, which were about Catholics versus Protestants, because the object of the Jacobites was to restore the Stuart monarchy to the throne. Stuarts were Catholics in place of the Hanoverians, who were, as the English monarchs are today, Protestants. And you may or may know that today it is still illegal in the UK for the sovereign to take a Catholic wife. King Charles is famously married to Camilla, and he was allowed to do that despite the fact that she's divorced, but he could not have married her if she were a Roman Catholic. Here's a illustration of the Highland Uprising in 1745, in which we have the English under the Duke of Cumberland on the right, massacring the Highland warriors on the left. Some of this fight, again, this was 1745. Hume was 32 years old. Smith was 22. Some of the fighting took place right outside Edinburgh. So, most important, these intellectual ideas that Smith put into modern Western economics, which were the foundations of capitalism, had strong resonance with the new religious thinking of the time and place. Religious belief was no longer tied to these concepts of depravity of the human character and predestination of human destiny. And instead, there was this more expansive view of human agency and more optimistic view of the human character. And I think these religious ideas were part of the worldview or vision that people of that time brought to their thinking about the secular world, including economics. So that in effect, what Smith was doing, and his contemporaries too, they were secularizing the dominant religious thinking of their time and place. And I argue in my, we don't have time for it, but I argue in my book that this religiously motivated economic thinking in time survived the passing of the initial religious influence that gave rise to it. And here we are today. Economics is still all about religious human choices and possibilities. If you take an undergraduate course in economics, what do they do in the very first semester? They talk to you about the choices made by individual households and individual firms. The first fundamental welfare theorem is still the heart of our analytical apparatus. What do they do in the second semester? They tell you about how all of these individual decisions made by households and firms aggregate up into a general equilibrium, and what are the optimality properties of that. And I think this expansive and optimistic view from the day of Smith and Hume remains ours as well. And I think, especially in my country, this initially religious influence has resonated ever since. The development of economics as a discipline that came down right through the 19th and 20th centuries, even as the economy changed dramatically, and therefore the questions that economists ask changed along with it, has continued to exhibit these same properties. I think this pervaded the ongoing debate through those centuries about the role of government. And I think today it's very visible in the role of that religion plays in shaping the behavior, including the voting behavior of ordinary Americans. And I'd like to conclude with a few remarks about voting behavior, since, as I'm sure you're aware, we have an election in my country coming up just, what is it, 9 days from now. And I want to argue that this religious influence is not just a matter of intellectual history. So let me conclude with a few arguments about voting behavior. A question that economists ask all the time is why so many Americans seem to vote against what appears to be their personal economic self-interest. Have all sorts of people who are know that they will never be in the top income tax bracket, but who say it's very important to them to keep the top tax bracket down. Well, the standard explanation of this phenomenon from our political science colleagues is that we have, as we do in most democracies, not a direct democracy, but a representative democracy. We don't vote on policies. You don't in your country either. We vote on candidates. And that wouldn't matter except that we have too few parties to span the space of available public policy choices. If there were enough parties, then it wouldn't matter, but we don't have them. And we can illustrate this for the US just by a simple two-issue position. Suppose people have different ideas on economic issues and differing ideas on social issues. Well, that immediately gives rise to four positions. I've arrayed this so that people whom I've put on the left of the diagram favor policies that are in the interests of low-income people, and on the right we have people who favor policies that are in the interests of high-income people. People who favor socially conservative policies are put on the top, and socially liberal policies are on the bottom. So we have four possibilities, and even if nothing else mattered but these two sets of policies, we would therefore require four political parties to span the space. Well, we don't have that in my country. It's obvious that Republicans have a fairly natural home in the upper right here. People who find themselves in the lower left have a fairly obvious home in the Democratic Party. But what about people in the upper left? That is, people who would be helped by economic policies that favor low-income people, but who nonetheless favor socially conservative policies. It turns out that this is not a small group. Here are the voting data. This is from 2 elections ago, 2016. The red dots are people who voted for Mr. Trump. The blue dots are people who voted for Mrs. Clinton. As you can see, the red people in the upper right quadrant voted Republican. People in the lower left mostly voted Democrat. No surprise there. And there weren't very many people in the lower right quadrant, that is, favoring low-income policies and favoring high-income policies and socially liberal policies. So we could worry about that, but why bother? Because there are not many people there. But fully 30% of the American electorate is in that upper left quadrant. Well, what about them? The tendency seems to be now for these people to vote Republican. So why do they do that? Thomas Frank, not really a political scientist, but more a journalist, has a very famous book from a few years ago in which he argued that the two parties, this happens because the two parties have become more and more similar on the economic dimension, and therefore there's not much to choose. And therefore, he thinks it's the political dimension that winds up dominating. Well, this may be true, but importantly, for purposes of our conversation right at the moment, this leaves no room for religious thinking. And I want to show you that religious thinking does matter for the American electorate. And we can't do exit polling on individual policy issues because, to repeat, we don't vote for policies, we vote for candidates. But we have plenty, as I'm sure you do in your country as well, we have plenty of single issue opinion polling. And so let me show you just 3 of them. First, here's a poll asking whether Americans would prefer a smaller government that provides fewer services, or alternatively, a larger government that provides more services. You don't have to know a lot about American politics to know that Americans are pretty evenly divided on this. In this poll, across all Americans, it was 51-49. 51% wanted a smaller government. Mainline Protestants was somewhat more, 59%. But look at what happens when we get to the evangelical denominations. Evangelicals, 64% wanted a smaller government. And when we get to those evangelical denominations that self-identify as traditionalist, it's not 64, it's 69. Well, where does this come from? I argue in my book that this is a straightforward consequence of the kind of religious thinking that we're analyzing here. Here's another poll. This is asking Americans whether they agree with the proposition government welfare programs do more good than harm. So it's favoring welfare programs because people can't get out of poverty until their basic needs are met. Once again, you don't have to know much about American politics to know that the country is very evenly divided. In this case, it's exactly even. 50% agree, 50% disagree. Among mainline Protestants, it's almost the same. But look at the evangelicals. Evangelicals as a whole, 38% only agree with that proposition, and among the traditionalist evangelicals, 33. Here's one last one, and then I'll stop. This is asking whether people would like to abolish estate taxation. In the United States, fewer than one family out of 250 is connected to anything, any kind of an estate that would be taxable. Estates are taxable only if they're above $26 million. So you have to be right up there in the income distribution to worry about this. On the right axis, I've indicated the percent of each group that would favor getting rid of estate taxation, abolishing it. That's the red bar. And as you can see, astonishingly, 46% of all Americans would like to abolish the estate tax, even though it applies only above $26 million. Now, on the left axis, I've indicated, because the comparisons are interesting, the average income for the group. And so, of course, for the US population as a whole, the average income is 100% of the population mean. If we go to Republicans, Republicans have above average incomes, and therefore it's not surprising that more of them than the average would like to abolish estate taxes. Democrats, no surprise. Democrats have lower than average incomes, and they're not so opposed to estate taxation. Mainline Protestants, again, no surprise, modestly higher than average incomes, modestly higher than average opposition to estate taxation. But look at the evangelicals. The evangelicals have lower incomes even than the Democrats, and yet they're more likely than the population average to oppose estate taxation. Where does that come from? It clearly tells you that religious influences are having a very major effect, not on the social policy. We all, if we were talking about things like abortion and same-sex marriage, this would be no surprise whatsoever, but we're not. This is about things like welfare policies. It's about things like estate taxation, and I could show you some on income taxation as well. So, to conclude, the usual political science story in which our political science colleagues talk to us about representative democracy and not enough parties to span the space of policy choices just can't explain this pattern. But I think this alternative explanation having to do with religious thinking can. So to conclude, let me summarize. Modern Western economics was and is a product of the Enlightenment, yes, but this does not mean that religion had nothing to do with it, and I argue that religious thinking was and remains a central part of that story, and I think that has come right down to us in the 21st century, and if you want to see it in action today, just look at the behavior of Americans thinking about economic policy. So why don't I conclude, and I don't know whether we're planning any discussion or questions, but whatever we want to do, I'm at your disposal.
Thank you very much, esteemed professor and friend, for your brilliant presentation in this conference. Thank you very much. Well, everybody, my name is Luis David Fernandez Zambrano. It is sincerely a great honor to join this intellectual journey on reflections to examine from multiple angles and through a deeply interdisciplinary reading intersection between religion and the emergence of modern economics. Furthermore, it is a privilege to contribute my perspective alongside and remarkable figure the most relevant sector of the global economic, my distinguished colleague and friend, the renowned Professor Benjamin Friedman. First, I would like to base my reflection on three central methodological strategies aimed at rethinking the intersection between economics, religion, and other related disciplines that expands the scope of analysis. The first strategy relies on logic of intelligibility that seek to develop a contextual genealogy through the study of historical and biographical processes. This approach will allow us to identify the strategic vector and coordinates necessary to redefine a more precise understanding of the emergence of modern economics, reconstructing the early pathways that gave rise to its development. Secondly, I would like to frame my reflections between epistemological strategy that enables us to recognize how certain religious knowledge from the medieval era profoundly shares contemporary ways of thinking about describing truth, traditions, and economic discourses. It is crucial first adopts clarifying stance regarding the differences big in the methodologies of medieval religious thought marked by secularized religious diversity and the strategies of modern economic thought. We extend to approach religious institutions from a more corporate perspective. All this unfolds within an historical context where democratic values have often been indulged, navigating a fragile path that have, in many cases, and often been underdanced. In many cases, they threaten the great being of humanity. Lastly, I will propose methodological principles grounded in logic of interdisciplinarity aimed at attempting the knowledge and practices of the economics and religious spheres that have evolved over centuries. The intersections is to create a framework suitable for identifying, regulating, and optimizing governmental qualities, both in the public and private sector, with the aim of the redefining the economic order at varying scales. This approach seeks to cultivate different expand essential democratic values such as respect, tolerance for diverse thinking, empathy, and solidarity values necessary to confront contemporary challenges. Through a multidimensional method, we aim to transcend both national and temporal boundaries, projecting this principle across the generation and decades. As we explore the chapter of history, we can recognize with aspects such as the centrality of the medieval era and how true and powerful influence scholastic philosophy taught these contours and physiology and academic choices of the 20th and 3rd century were redefined. This challenge not only thus in insular territories like Great Britain, but also like the administrative and resource management foundations and various European civic states. This historical legals remains a link in the institutional structure that continue to shape the economic and society to date. It is no trivial fact that during the Crusades and the era of absolute monarchies, when figures such as the Sac King Frederick Barbarossa, the legends on King Arthur, and the works of Boccaccio emerged, principalistic were adorned with a scholastic philosophy that granted significant power to the Roman Catholic Church. This influence extended not only to the political realms, but also to the economic spheres, is shaping the course of monarchies. Laws, of course, articulated as a tool that legitimizes the political and commercial decisions on medieval regions. This had a crucial impact on the trade routes, naval expeditions, scheme way to strengthen the economic foundation of monarchies. And the establishment of viceroyalties and colonies, whose purpose was to accumulate precious minerals or build trade networks. This activity also carried a marked religious dimensions. In this context, we can recall the religious influence on the most important university in England, such as Oxford and Cambridge, which clearly reflect the spiritual imprint. It is no coincidence that many of their college shared names like Jesus College, Corpus Christi, Trinity College, or Christ Church, evidencing the religious legacy of shows distant centuries. It is also relevant to ability that within this cloister emerged figures like John Locke, who through works such as the Second Treatise of Civil Governments, likes the foundation of philosophical liberalism. This movement provided 18th century monarchies with and crucial intellectual arsenals and challenge in the power of monarchical absolutism. This transformation culminate in a scenario where merchants not only gains economic power, but also secure representation and voting rights in the English Parliament, allowing them to negotiate more freely and purpose their short, medium, and long-term interests. Constitutional reforms were essential for commercial activity to gradually become effused with democratic values, alongside the expansion of opportunities for the exchange of goods and service and process of inclusions began for historical marginalized sector under legal or political categories, recognizing them as citizens. This expansion of economic opportunities was fundamental to sustaining empires such as the Prussians, the network of Spanish city-states, and the consolidation of English power. All these developments research the cultural and intellectual atmosphere in which Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill began to deepen their understanding of the world, challenge reflections on the past, and proposing solutions for the future. Adam Smith's monumental work, published in Scotland in 1017 1517 years, represent moral and philosophical approach to understand the ranks of the economics of his time. It is no coincidence that this philosophical and moral perspective was heavily influenced by the scholastic religion tradition intellectual, reflecting that the fields of the economic was still in the embryonic stage from a profoundly epistemological standpoint. This moral reading applied to economic undoubtedly responding to the needs of the time which religions in circumstance breaks both theological and moral dimension exerted a significant influence on the emerging economic processes in Scotland and England during in 18th century and 19th century. This historical correlation between religion and economic understand the central objective in this conference this present. It is nothing more than a projection of the horizon of the past, and understanding this intersection is essential to address contemporary challenges. 30. I will attempt to establish certain methodological principles called symbolic and interdisciplinary logic capable of adapting knowledge and practices in the economic and religious spheres, which have been progressively constructed over the century. All of these must be framed within an unwavering respect for human rights, democratic principles, and virtues of diplomacy, fostering dialogue with those who think differently in order to seek concrete and effective solutions to common problems affecting of humanity and life on our planet. This is precisely why we can identify a profoundly religious quality from a methodological standpoint within the vast fields of modern economics. This quality has roots far older than at Middle Age, reaching back even further than Socrates, Plato, or Anaxagoras. I refer to the tendency to oppose immutable dogmas about reality, something that has been widely challenged from an epistemological perspective. To think that economics is governed by absolute truth, formulated in past centuries and universally applicable, is an affront to those of striving to provide a solid scientific foundation for interpreting today measure social problems and development effective mechanisms to solve them. I am convinced that economics with a less dogmatic perspective and better positions to strengthen democratic and scientific virtues in their lives, those capable of keeping an open minds, understanding and incorporating relevant variables specific to the circumstances, the space, and the ones to can embody why is known at Harvard University as celebrating the difference of thought, and at the University of Buenos Aires as learning to coexist in diversity. Both qualities are essential for authentic democracy, both inside and outside the university, radiating these virtues through the rest of society. It is clear, therefore, that combating juridical or economic thinking based on religious dogmatic tradition is an effective step toward expanding democratic values in both the public and private sector. Every era our circumstances demands the development of new economics variables. Is we wish to learn effectively from the virtues and methodological errors of religious past. We must preserve what is vulnerable from those methods and overcome what is deficient. We cannot defend the indefinite solely in the name of the past, much less in the name of the brilliant and renowned figure who, unfortunately, did not have to confront the economic and social challenge of our time, marked by globalization, advances in quantum computing, and the geopolitical challenge of international trade. All of the above invites us and perhaps complex or deeply reflects on needs to reinvent economics who can adapt to each era and historical circumstances. We must learn from the past reflectively without methodological prejudice, always grounding in the concrete reality in order in effectively address today's problem. As Wolfgang Goethe wrote, every time has already been told and written. Now is time to think and read again. However, I believe that thinking and reading are activities common to every era. What truly matters is starting to develop effective remedies that lead to lasting solutions. In the words of Jesus of Nazareth, deeply influenced by the legendary Jewish intellectual traditions. By their fruits you shall know them. In the fortunate race of destiny. In the fortunate race of destiny. Thank you very much for bearing with me. Bien, ahora me parece que es enteramente fundamental pasar a la rueda de preguntas, cuestiones. The question.
And I'm out of time now, so I'm going to leave you. So thank you very much, and I've enjoyed being with you. Good luck with the rest of your conference.
Thank you very much, my friends.